I never thought of myself as someone who'd get caught up in neighborhood drama. My life was built around simplicity and predictability, and I liked it that way. My name is Michael Randolph. I'm 37 years old, an unassuming software engineer who works from home in a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon. My days are usually spent troubleshooting code or joining virtual meetings, but my favorite part of the day comes afterward, the time I spend unwinding in my backyard. For 5 years, this little pocket of tranquility had been my sanctuary. My backyard wasn't particularly large or extravagant, but it had everything I needed to escape the demands of my work. Towering oaks provided shade, and the gentle rustling of their leaves created a soothing soundtrack. A wooden fence bordered the property, giving me privacy from the outside world. Between two of the oldest trees hung my pride and joy, a sturdy hammock where I could lose myself in books or just stare up at the sky. Weekends were especially precious. That's when I'd step away from the screens and sink into the hammock with a glass of lemonade and a novel. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. A little world where nothing else mattered. I'd cultivated the space over the years, planting lilac bushes along the fence line and arranging a small patio area with chairs for when friends visited. The neighborhood itself had always been quiet. Most of my neighbors were retired couples or families with kids who played basketball in their driveways. We'd wave politely when we crossed paths, but I wasn't particularly close to anyone. That suited me fine. I wasn't antisocial, but I valued my solitude. However, everything changed a few weeks ago when my neighbors on the right side of my property moved out. The Wilsons, an older couple who'd lived there for as long as I'd been around, sold their home and moved closer to their grandchildren. Their departure was bittersweet. I'd grown used to their routine and the quiet rhythm they brought to the block. The new owners, though, were a different story. I first noticed them on moving day. It was a chaotic affair. Large trucks idling on the street, furniture being hauled in and out, and voices barking orders. I glimpsed them from my office window, a stocky, middle-aged man with a loud voice, and a woman who seemed equally commanding. There was a tension about them that I couldn't quite place. They worked late into the evening, their shouts breaking the usual calm of the neighborhood. I considered walking over to introduce myself, but decided against it. They had enough on their plate, and I figured we'd cross paths eventually. In the days that followed, I caught glimpses of them here and there. The man, whose name I later learned was Todd, was often outside, tinkering with tools or inspecting his yard. He carried himself with a kind of restless energy, his movements deliberate and assertive. The woman, whom I rarely saw, seemed quieter but no less focused. From what I could tell, they were busy setting up their new life. I told myself it wasn't my business to worry about them. Change happens. Neighbors come and go. Still, there was something about Todd's presence that unsettled me. Maybe it was the way he stared at things for too long, like he was trying to assert control over every inch of his surroundings. Or maybe it was just the shift in the neighborhood dynamic. I wasn't sure. All I knew was that my peaceful little corner of the world suddenly felt less predictable. I didn't dwell on it, though. The backyard was still mine, and as long as I could retreat there, I felt safe. That Friday evening, the end of a long work week, was no different. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned a soft orange, I carried a book and a glass of lemonade outside. The air was crisp, but not cold, and the leaves above swayed gently in the breeze. I settled into the hammock, letting its fabric cradle me, and began to read. It was the kind of evening I lived for, quiet, unassuming, and entirely mine. Little did I know that sense of peace was about to be shattered in a way I could never have imagined. The evening started out like any other Friday. I was in my hammock, the fabric gently swaying as I flipped through the pages of a mystery novel. The sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the yard, and the air smelled faintly of lilac blossoms from the bushes I'd planted along the fence. It was the perfect way to unwind after a long week of staring at code. But then I felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling you get when you know someone's watching you. I glanced around the yard, half expecting to see a stray cat or a bird perched somewhere nearby. Nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Looking up, I spotted a figure standing in the second-floor window of the neighbor's house. The blinds were slightly parted, and the outline of a man was unmistakable. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. At first, I tried to shake it off. Maybe it wasn't as sinister as it seemed. People have every right to look out their windows, right? Still, there was something about the way he lingered, unmoving, that made me uneasy. I forced myself to focus back on my book, telling myself I was overthinking it. But even as I tried to immerse myself in the story, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was under surveillance. The unease crept in further when I heard the creak of a gate. My head snapped up, and I saw the same man from the window, a stocky, middle-aged guy with a no-nonsense expression, walking briskly across his yard. He reached the shared fence, stopping just a few feet from where my hammock swayed. His arms were crossed tightly, and his face was set in a scowl. "Hey, you!" he shouted, his voice sharp and demanding. I sat up, startled by his tone. Yeah?" I replied hesitantly, unsure if he was even talking to me. "What the hell are you doing back here?" he barked, his eyes narrowing. I frowned, confusion settling over me. "I'm reading?" My answer sounded more like a question, as though I needed to justify it. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "You've got no business being on this property." At first, I thought I'd misheard him. Was this guy serious? "Excuse me?" I said, now more firmly. "This is my yard. I live here." "No, you don't," he shot back, his tone laced with irritation. "I know the property lines. That fence is on my land, and you're trespassing." I stared at him, dumbfounded. The absurdity of his claim left me momentarily speechless. I'd lived in this house for years. The deed was clear, and I'd never had any issues with property lines before. "You must be mistaken," I said finally, trying to keep my voice calm. "I've been living here for 5 years, and this has always been my yard. The fence is right on the boundary." His expression darkened further. "Don't lie to me. I spoke to the previous owners. They told me about this setup. That fence, and everything behind it, belongs to me. Now get out." This was surreal. My heart started to pound as I processed what he was saying. I'd heard stories about disputes with neighbors, but this was something else. I stood my ground, unwilling to let him intimidate me. "Look, I don't know what you think you know, but I have the deed to this property. The fence is right where it's supposed to be. If there's been some kind of mix-up, we can talk about it calmly." But he wasn't interested in talking. His lips curled into a snarl as he reached behind his back. My stomach dropped when I saw what he pulled out, a handgun. The metallic glint in the fading sunlight made my breath catch. "You're gonna get out of here now," he said, his voice trembling slightly but still filled with menace. "I'm not gonna say it again." My legs felt like they'd turned to lead, and my hands instinctively rose in surrender. Whoa, okay. Let's not do anything rash," I said, my voice shaking. I'll go inside. All right? Just calm down." He didn't lower the gun. His eyes locked onto me, full of a kind of nervous anger that made the situation feel even more dangerous. Slowly, I climbed out of the hammock, every movement deliberate and careful. The ground felt unsteady beneath my feet as I backed away toward my house. "Stay right there," he yelled when I reached the patio door. His finger twitched on the trigger, and my breath hitched. "I'm not going anywhere," I assured him, though my voice betrayed how terrified I was. The door was just inches behind me, but I didn't dare make any sudden moves. My mind raced, searching for a way to defuse the situation. But there was no reasoning with someone this unhinged. In one swift motion, I reached behind me, found the doorknob, and pulled it open. Before he could react, I darted inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. My heart pounded in my chest as I crouched by the kitchen counter, trying to catch my breath. The realization hit me like a freight train. My quiet little life had just been shattered, and I wasn't sure how it would ever go back to normal. I crouched behind the kitchen counter, my chest heaving as I struggled to steady my breath. My hands shook so violently that I almost dropped my phone as I dialed 911. The operator answered in a calm, professional tone, but my voice trembled uncontrollably as I explained what had just happened. "There's a man in my backyard," I said, glancing nervously toward the window. "He's armed, he has a gun, and he thinks I'm trespassing on my own property." The operator's voice was reassuring, but it barely registered over the pounding of my heart. She assured me that officers were on their way and instructed me to stay hidden and not engage with the man again. I nodded reflexively, even though she couldn't see me. I clutched the phone like a lifeline, afraid to even peek out the window. From my position, I could hear Todd pacing on the other side of the fence. His muffled voice was barely audible through the walls, but the occasional shout sent shivers down my spine. I caught fragments of his words, something about trespassers and protecting what's his. His agitation was growing, and the thought of him turning that agitation into action terrified me. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The silence in my house amplified every sound: the creak of the floor beneath me, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant buzz of cicadas outside. And then, finally, the sound I'd been praying for: sirens. The wail of police cars grew louder, and a flicker of red and blue lights spilled across my walls. Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. What if Todd didn't cooperate? What if he resisted? I forced myself to stay low as I peeked out the corner of the kitchen window. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb, and 3 officers stepped out, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. They moved cautiously, but with purpose, their voices firm as they called out to Todd. "Sir, this is the police. Drop the weapon and step away from the fence." For a moment, there was no response. Todd remained near the fence, his body tense, his head swiveling toward the officers. My stomach churned as I imagined all the ways this could go wrong. He could refuse, or worse, he could escalate the situation. Finally, he moved. Slowly, Todd lowered the gun, placing it on the ground as the officers commanded. His hands rose above his head, and the tension in the air seemed to crackle like static electricity. 2 officers approached him, one securing the weapon while the other placed him in handcuffs. I sank back against the counter, the adrenaline coursing through me, making my legs tremble. The immediate danger seemed to be over, but my sense of safety was shattered. I couldn't bring myself to move until I heard a knock on my patio door. Peeking out, I saw one of the officers gesturing for me to come outside. His demeanor was calm but serious, and I forced myself to stand. When I opened the door, the cool night air hit me like a wave. "Are you Michael Randolph?" the officer asked. "Yes," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. "We need to ask you some questions about what happened," he said. "Are you okay?" I nodded weakly. I think so. Just shaken up." As I recounted the incident to the officers, I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Todd's accusations, the gun, the fear, it all felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. But this wasn't a dream. It was all too real, and I knew it wasn't over yet. After Todd was taken away, The officers spent some time documenting the scene, taking photos of the yard and the fence, and asking more questions. I showed them the deed to my property and the survey map, both of which clearly outlined the boundaries. The fence, the hammock, the lilac bushes. Everything was well within my property line. One officer nodded in acknowledgement, assuring me they'd include this in their report. I was grateful for their professionalism, but the fear lingered. My yard, my safe haven, now felt like a battleground. Even as the flashing red and blue lights faded into the distance, I couldn't shake the image of Todd's angry face or the way his hand had gripped that gun. I locked every door and window in my house that night, triple-checking each one before finally collapsing onto the couch, too wired to sleep in my bed. The next morning, I woke to find an official-looking envelope taped to my front door. My stomach churned as I opened it. It was a notice from the Homeowners Association. Apparently, Todd had wasted no time filing a complaint, claiming that my fence encroached on his property. They'd scheduled a hearing for the following week to address the matter. My frustration boiled over. How could someone escalate things this far over a fence? I called the number on the notice and explained the situation to the HOA representative, who sounded polite but non-committal. "We'll review all the evidence during the hearing," she said, her tone carefully neutral. It was clear they wouldn't take sides until the meeting. I knew I needed help. Later that day, I reached out to Grace Taylor, a lawyer my friend, Jason, had recommended. Grace was sharp and methodical, and after hearing my story, she assured me I had a strong case. "We'll need to gather all the documentation, your property deed, the survey map, and any communication you've had with him or the HOA," she said. "The more evidence we have, the better." Over the next few days, I threw myself into preparing for the hearing. Grace helped me organize my documents, and I even printed screenshots of the messages from the police dispatcher to show the timeline of the incident. But even as I busied myself with these tasks, I couldn't ignore the knot of anxiety that tightened every time I looked out the window. Todd was back. His car was parked in his driveway, and though I hadn't seen him outside yet, just knowing he was nearby sent my nerves into overdrive. I installed security cameras around my property, hoping that the presence of surveillance would deter any further confrontations. Still, the sight of his house filled me with dread. One evening, as I was reviewing my notes with Grace over the phone, I heard footsteps in my yard. My heart jumped into my throat. I glanced at the camera feed and saw Todd pacing along the shared fence line, his movements erratic and agitated. I couldn't hear what he was muttering, but the sight was enough to make me call the police again. When the officers arrived, they reminded Todd about the restraining order that was now in place, warning him to stay away from my property. He argued with them, his gestures wild, but eventually retreated inside. The officers assured me they'd include this incident in their report, but the encounter left me shaken. It was clear Todd wasn't backing down. The days leading up to the HOA hearing were some of the longest of my life. I couldn't relax, couldn't sleep. Every time I heard a noise outside, I imagined the worst. My hammock, once a symbol of peace, now sat empty in the yard, a stark reminder of how much had changed. All I could do was hope that the hearing would bring some resolution, though deep down, I knew this fight was far from over. The day of the Homeowners Association hearing arrived, and I felt like I was walking into a lion's den. The hearing was held in a small, bland meeting room at the community center, a far cry from the comfort of my backyard. Grace met me at the entrance, her calm and composed demeanor providing a much-needed anchor for my frayed nerves. Inside, a panel of 5 HOA board members sat at a long table, their expressions varying from mildly curious to downright bored. Todd was already there, seated with his lawyer, a wiry man in an ill-fitting suit who radiated an air of smug confidence. Todd, on the other hand, avoided my gaze. His arms were crossed tightly, his jaw set in a defiant scowl. The proceedings began with Todd's side presenting their case. His lawyer wasted no time launching into a convoluted argument about property lines, claiming that the previous owners had verbally confirmed that the fence and part of my yard actually belonged to Todd's property. There were no documents to support this claim, just vague anecdotes and speculation. Todd, however, nodded along, his expression growing more confident with every word his lawyer spoke. Grace waited patiently, letting them finish without interruption. When it was our turn, she stood and delivered a master class in legal clarity. She began by presenting my property deed, survey map, and the police report detailing the incident with Todd. The documents were clear, leaving no room for interpretation. The fence and the entire backyard were unquestionably mine. The board members leaned in as she spoke, flipping through the evidence with furrowed brows. "Mr. Randolph has lived on this property for over 5 years without incident," Grace said firmly. "The property lines are clearly documented and have never been in dispute until now. Mr. Harris's claims are not supported by any legal documentation and are based solely on hearsay." When I was called to speak, I described the events leading up to the hearing. I spoke of Todd's aggression, his baseless accusations, and the terrifying moment he pulled a gun on me. My voice shook at times, but I held my ground, determined to show the board exactly how far Todd had gone. Todd's lawyer tried to counter, suggesting I had overreacted and that the dispute could have been handled neighbor to neighbor. But Grace swiftly dismantled that narrative. "Brandishing a firearm and making threats is not how property disputes are resolved," she said, her tone sharp. After a brief recess, the board returned with their decision. The head of the HOA, an elderly woman with glasses perched on her nose, delivered the verdict. "Based on the evidence presented, the board finds no merit in Mr. Harris's claims. The property line remains as documented. Mr. Harris is urged to resolve any future disputes through proper legal channels." Relief washed over me, though it was tempered by lingering unease. Todd sat stiffly, his face a mask of anger and embarrassment. As Grace and I left the room, she placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "This is a win," she said. "But stay vigilant. This isn't the kind of man who backs down easily." She was right. While the hearing had ended in my favor, I knew this wasn't the last I'd see of Todd. The HOA ruling should have felt like the end of it all, but as I walked back to my car that day, I knew better. Todd's reaction during the hearing, the clenched fists, the burning glare he refused to direct my way, told me this was far from over. Still, for the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of validation. The facts were on my side, and now they were officially recognized. But the shadows of anxiety lingered, stretching over everything. Returning home, I parked in my driveway and stared at the house across the street. Todd's car was in its usual spot, but the curtains on his windows were drawn tightly shut. The silence felt oppressive, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. I took my time unloading my things and went inside, locking the door behind me out of habit, a habit that had become second nature since the night Todd pulled that gun. Life didn't immediately go back to normal. For days, I found myself peering out the window at every sound. Footsteps on the sidewalk, a car door slamming, even the wind rattling the lilac bushes. All of it sent my nerves into overdrive. My backyard, once a sanctuary, felt tainted. The hammock hung unused, swaying in the breeze as if waiting for me to reclaim it. But I couldn't. Not yet. Grace had been right about staying vigilant. A restraining order had been issued, but Todd's unpredictability made it hard to trust that paper alone. I installed additional security cameras, motion-activated lights, and reinforced locks on every door and window. My friends assured me I was being overly cautious, but I wasn't willing to take chances. Despite the precautions, Todd's presence loomed. He didn't approach the yard or make contact, but I saw him pacing on his porch or standing by his window, glaring in my direction. His silent intimidation tactics weren't overt enough to call the police, but they kept me on edge. To cope, I leaned on my support system. Jason, my closest friend, visited often, dragging me away from my anxious thoughts with jokes and beers on the patio. His presence reminded me of what I had fought to protect: my home, my peace, my life. One Saturday afternoon, Jason insisted I go outside. "It's your yard," he said firmly, nodding toward the hammock. "Take it back." I hesitated, but followed his advice. Sitting in the hammock, the fabric warm from the sun, I felt a flicker of the peace I used to know. The breeze rustled the leaves above, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to exhale fully. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. My sanctuary was still mine, and I wasn't ready to let anyone take it away from me. As the weeks passed, the intensity of my fear began to dull, replaced by a quiet determination to move forward. The restraining order against Todd held firm, and though I still saw him occasionally, his actions remained confined to angry glares through his window. I couldn't say I trusted that he'd stay in line. But for now, the storm seemed to have subsided. My house, my yard, and my life were slowly becoming mine again. The hammock, once a painful reminder of everything I'd lost, started to feel like a challenge, a space I needed to reclaim. At first it was difficult. The memories of that night, of Todd standing there with a gun in his hand, were burned into my mind. But each time I ventured out, I felt a little stronger. Sitting in the hammock, listening to the wind rustle the lilac bushes, I began to remember what peace felt like. Jason and a few other friends helped me restore that sense of normalcy. One sunny afternoon, they came over with snacks and drinks, insisting on turning my backyard into a mini gathering spot. We laughed, shared stories, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself relax. The sound of their voices blended with the natural rhythm of the yard, making it feel alive again. Still, I was under no illusions. The scars of what had happened wouldn't fade overnight. Therapy helped me process the fear and anger, and I found solace in talking about it openly with people who cared. Piece by piece, I was rebuilding not just my backyard sanctuary, but the sense of safety I'd once taken for granted. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I lay in the hammock with a book in hand. The air was warm, the scent of lilacs faint, but soothing. I glanced toward Todd's house, half expecting to see him lurking in his usual spot, but his windows were dark. For the first time in months, I didn't feel his shadow looming over me. This wasn't the ending I'd envisioned when I bought this house 5 years ago, but it was an ending I could accept. My yard, my home, and my life had been tested in ways I never could have imagined, but I was still here, stronger than I'd thought possible. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, I let myself smile. The peace I'd fought for was mine, and no one would take it from me again.